2 years after the morning he should have died, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo took his own life in a command cave on the island of Saipan. He was 57 years old. The empire he had served for 40 years was hours from losing the Marianas. American Marines were closing on his command post. The battle was already lost. According to his aide, his last words were not about Saipan. They were not about the war. They were not about the empire he had served. They were about a ship. The ship was called Akagi. She had been resting at the bottom of the Pacific for 2 years and 1 month. And on the morning of June 4th, 1942, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo had stood on her bridge and made the worst decision of his career, inside a trap whose existence he did not yet understand. This is how he learned. The fog was lifting over the central Pacific. On the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the dawn break over an empty sea. He was 55 years old, a torpedo specialist by training, not a flyer, with a face creased by salt wind and a manner so quiet his officers called him the Old Owl. Beside him stood his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, 49, a man who finished Nagumo's sentences and made his decisions sound inevitable. It was June 4th, 1942. For 6 months, these two men had ridden a war machine that could not lose. From Pearl Harbor to Wake, from Darwin to Ceylon, 4 Japanese carriers had crossed a third of the world and burned every fleet that came near them. 248 aircraft. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the same aircrews who had cratered the American battle line at anchor on December 7th, who had hunted the British across the Indian Ocean, who had not lost a single fleet carrier in any operation since the war began. Today, they had come to finish the Americans. 300 miles to the northwest, on the most powerful warship ever built, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in the operations room of the 72,000-ton battleship Yamato. 58 years old, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned Tokyo before the war that Japan had 6 months, perhaps a year, to win a victory big enough to force America to the negotiating table. 6 months were almost up. Midway Atoll was the bait, 2 slivers of coral 1,200 miles northwest of Hawaii, a runway and a fuel dump and a garrison of Marines. The Americans could not afford to lose it. They would have to send their carriers, and when the carriers came, Yamamoto's trap would close. 200 warships, 7 battleships in the main body. 4 fleet carriers at the spear, an invasion convoy carrying 5,000 soldiers, a diversionary force striking the Aleutian Islands 1,000 miles to the north. It was a plan of breathtaking complexity, designed to split the American attention, isolate the American carriers, and crush them in a single battle of decision. There was only one problem. The Americans had read it. 4,000 miles to the east, in a basement room beneath the headquarters building at Pearl Harbor, a thin, eccentric man in a red smoking jacket and carpet slippers had been awake for most of 2 weeks. His name was Joseph Rochefort. He was 42 years old, a commander in the United States Navy, head of a cryptanalysis unit known only as Station HYPO. He did not look like a man who would change the course of a war. He looked like a man who had forgotten where he kept his shoes. But he had spent the spring breaking the Japanese naval code. The code was called JN-25. It was the operational cipher of the entire Imperial Japanese Navy. By late May, Rochefort and his team had pieced together enough of it to read the outlines of a coming offensive. The target was identified only as AF. Rochefort believed AF was Midway. The brass in Washington did not, so Rochefort baited a trap of his own. He had Midway transmit a plain language message reporting that its freshwater distillation plant had broken down. 2 days later, Japanese radio traffic mentioned that AF was short of freshwater. The argument was over. Admiral Chester Nimitz, 57, commander of the Pacific Fleet, did not hesitate. He took the 3 carriers he had, Enterprise, Hornet, and the limping Yorktown, hastily patched together in 72 hours after the wounds she had taken at the Coral Sea, and he stationed them northeast of Midway, in a square of empty ocean his men had named Point Luck. He placed his senior tactical commander at the front, Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, 57, flying his flag on Yorktown. Beneath him, on Enterprise, was Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, 55, a quiet man with the disposition of an undertaker. Then Nimitz waited. 2,000 miles to the west, the Kido Butai was sailing into the most elaborately prepared ambush of the 20th century, and not one Japanese officer knew it. On the morning of June 3rd, the diversion went off exactly as designed. Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosugaya, 53, led a small task force against the American base at Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands, 1,000 miles to the north. Bombs fell, buildings burned, the deception was textbook, it did not matter. Nimitz, holding Rochefort's decrypts in his hand, simply ignored it. Aboard Akagi, no one knew this either. Below the bridge, in a small cabin that smelled of fever, Commander Minoru Genda lay in bed. He was 37 years old. He had been the principal air operations planner of the Pearl Harbor attack. He had designed the doctrines by which Japanese carriers fought. And on the morning that those doctrines would face their first true test, he was burning with pneumonia, drifting in and out of sleep, unable to walk to the bridge. Down another passageway, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, 39, the man who had led the Pearl Harbor strike and radioed the immortal signal Tora, 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 lay propped against pillows with his abdomen taped. He had collapsed 3 days earlier from appendicitis and had been operated on at sea. He could walk, he could not fly, he could not lead. The two men who knew most about how Japanese carriers attacked other carriers had been removed from the equation before the first plane lifted off. At 4:15 in the morning, Akagi turned into the wind. Engines coughed and roared. 108 aircraft thundered down the wooden decks of the 4 carriers. 0 fighters, Val dive bombers, Kate-level bombers loaded with high explosive bombs for the airfield at Midway. The strike commander was Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga, 31 years old, a quiet officer with a wife and a young child at home. He climbed into his cockpit, gunned his engine, and lifted off into the pre-dawn dark. He would not come back the same man. By 7 that morning, the bombs had fallen on Midway. Marine fighter pilots flying obsolete Buffaloes had been shot out of the sky. The runway had been cratered, the fuel dump had been hit, but the airfield was not destroyed. The hangars were still standing. The defenders still had teeth. Tomonaga keyed his microphone and sent the 4 words that would unmake everything. There is need for a second attack. On the bridge of Akagi, Nagumo received the signal and made his decision. The 93 aircraft he had held back in reserve, armed with the heavy torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs intended to kill American warships, would be rearmed for a second strike on Midway. Land attack bombs, high explosive, the right weapons for the airfield, Kusaka agreed. It was the doctrinally correct call. There were no American carriers within range. Intelligence had said so. Their own search planes had said so. The reserve aircraft would be repurposed, and then they would finish the airfield, and then they would land the returning strike, and then they would sail east to hunt for any American ships that might dare to appear. Below decks, the hangars became scenes of methodical chaos. Torpedoes weighing nearly a ton each were unbolted from their racks, rolled into magazines, and replaced with land attack bombs. Fuel hoses snaked across steel floors. Mechanics topped off tanks. The work could not be hurried. It could not be undone halfway through. 2 hours earlier, 15 miles to the east, a single seaplane had finally managed to launch from a heavy cruiser called Tone. The aircraft was Tone Scout No. 4. Its assignment was the northeast sector, the long, lonely arc of ocean that lay directly between the Kido Butai and the empty square Nimitz had named Point Luck. It was supposed to launch at 4:30 in the morning, while the first Midway strike was still thundering down Akagi's deck. It launched at 5. The catapult had jammed. For 30 minutes that dawn, while mechanics cursed and pounded on the launch rail with hammers, Japan's only eye on the most important sector of ocean in the Pacific sat motionless on a cruiser's deck. By the time it finally roared into the sky, the first Midway strike was already 30 miles east, climbing into the sunrise. Now, with the rearming chaos in full swing below decks, that scout was finally where it should have been 4 hours earlier. For 2 more hours, the morning unfolded the way Yamamoto and Nagumo and Kusaka believed it must. Returning aircraft from the Midway strike circled, low on fuel, waiting to land. Mechanics rolled torpedoes into magazines and bombs out to launchers. The sea was empty in every direction the Japanese commanders looked. Then, at 7:28, the radio crackled. The voice belonged to the observer in tones late-launched scout. "Have sighted 10 enemy surface units." On the bridge of Akagi, a young signal officer wrote the message down with a hand that did not at first understand what it was holding. He carried it across the deck to Nagumo. Kusaka leaned in to read. The two men looked at each other. 10 ships, northeast, in the empty sector, hours of steaming from Midway. Nagumo turned to his chief of staff and asked the only question that mattered. What kind of ships? The scout had not said. 8 minutes later, it would. For 8 minutes, Akagi sailed east through a sea that was no longer empty. On the bridge, Nagumo waited. Kusaka waited. Around them, junior officers spoke in low voices because they understood, without needing to be told, that the silence on the radio was now louder than any signal. 10 enemy surface units. Northeast, in a sector they had been told was clear. Then at 7:36, the second message arrived. The scout had identified the formation as 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. The bridge exhaled. Surface ships, heavy gunfire targets, no aircraft. The reserve aircraft below decks, now half rearmed with land attack bombs, would not need their torpedoes after all. Nagumo turned back to the chart. Kusaka began to speak. He never finished. At 8 o'clock, the scout's third transmission cut through the bridge speaker. Enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. A carrier. Singular. Nagumo did not move. The young signal officer who carried the message would later say that for several seconds the bridge sounded as if every man on it had stopped breathing at the same instant. Kusaka set his hand against the chart table. He did not look at his admiral. A carrier meant aircraft. Aircraft meant the assumption that had governed every decision of the past 5 hours had been wrong. The Americans were not 2 days away. They were here. They had been here when Tomonaga's strike took off. They had been here when the first bombs fell on Midway. They had been here, somewhere in the sector that Tone's catapult had failed to cover since the night before, and they had launched first. What Nagumo did not know and could not know was that the strike aircraft from 3 American carriers were already in the air. They had been in the air since around 6 o'clock. They had been searching for him for an hour. The math was already finished. He just did not yet have the numbers. He turned to Kusaka. What is the position of our reserve strike? The answer was the worst possible one. Below decks, in the hangars of Akagi and Kaga and Soryu and Hiryu, the 93 reserve aircraft were now in a state of partial disarmament. Some torpedoes had been removed and stowed in magazines. Others were still racked. Bombs had been wheeled out. Fuel lines were uncoupled in some bays and connected in others. There was no clean state to revert to. There was no clean state to advance from. Nagumo had 3 options. He could push the partially armed reserve aircraft over the side, recover the Midway strike force, whose pilots were now circling overhead with empty fuel tanks, then rearm everything from scratch and launch a properly coordinated attack against the American carriers. Time required, 2 hours. He could launch what he had immediately. Half the planes would attack with land attack bombs that would not penetrate American flight decks. Half would have no fighter escort, because the Zeros were still aloft chasing American torpedo bombers that had been arriving in scattered suicidal waves for the past hour. Time required, 20 minutes. Effect on a hardened naval target, negligible, or he could finish what he had started, recover the Midway strike, properly rearm the reserve, launch a single overwhelming blow when everything was ready. This was the decision doctrine demanded. It was the decision Gender, lying in his fevered cabin 2 decks below, would have advised. It was the decision Kusaka now urged, quietly, professionally, his finger tapping the chart twice as he spoke. Strike with full force when we are ready, Admiral. Never piecemeal against carriers. Nagumo gave the order. The reserve aircraft would be properly rearmed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. The Midway strike force would land first. Everything would be done in sequence, by the book, the way the Imperial Japanese Navy had trained for it for a generation. It was the wrong decision. It was also the right decision. Both things were true. Both things would be true for as long as men argued about Midway, which would be the rest of the 20th century and beyond. Nagumo had chosen the answer his doctrine, his training, and his chief of staff all told him was correct. He had simply chosen it inside a trap whose existence none of them yet understood. Below decks, the work began again, in reverse. The land attack bombs that had been mounted in the past hour were unbolted and rolled back into the magazines. The torpedoes that had been stowed 40 minutes earlier were dragged back out, hoisted and bolted to their racks. Mechanics worked in passages crowded with ordnance. Bombs lay stacked along bulkheads. Torpedoes leaned against elevator shafts. Fuel hoses, charged with high-octane aviation gasoline, ran in tangles across the steel deck plates. The Japanese carriers had been designed for speed and aircraft capacity. They did not have armored hangar decks. Their fuel lines were not nitrogen purged like American fuel systems. A single spark in a hangar that looked like this one. Bombs and torpedoes loose, fuel everywhere, aircraft fully gassed and engines running, would not produce damage. It would produce an annihilation event. Above the carriers at altitude, the first American aircraft were beginning to appear. They arrived in pieces, ragged, exhausted, having flown to the edge of their fuel range to find the Kido Butai. They did not arrive in a coordinated wave. They arrived as separate squadrons, lost from one another, hitting from different angles at different times. The torpedo bombers came first. At 9:20, 15 Devastators of Torpedo Squadron 8, flying from the carrier Hornet under the command of Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, broke through the clouds and saw the Japanese carriers spread beneath them. Waldron was 42, a man with high cheekbones and a sense of fatalism that had survived 2 years of training. The night before, he had written a letter to his squadron telling them that even if he were left alone with only one plane, he would go in. There was no fighter escort. They had been separated from theirs an hour earlier. The Devastators were obsolete, slow, and lightly armored. Their Mark 13 torpedoes were unreliable. They were carrying them straight and level at 100 knots into the most heavily defended airspace in the Pacific. Every one of them knew what was about to happen. They went in anyway. Japanese Zeros tore them apart. The carrier's anti-aircraft guns raked them at low altitude. Devastator after Devastator burst into orange flame and cartwheeled into the sea. 15 aircraft launched. 15 aircraft shot down. Of the 30 crewmen, only one survived. Ensign George Gay, 25, who would watch the rest of the battle from the water, clinging to a seat cushion under a piece of black floating debris while Japanese destroyers steamed past him without noticing. Not one torpedo found a target. 14 Devastators of Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise arrived next. They were chewed apart in the same way. 10 of them did not return. 12 Devastators of Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown came last, with a fighter escort that was promptly outnumbered and overwhelmed. 7 were shot down. In the space of 1 hour, the United States Navy had thrown 41 torpedo bombers at the Japanese carriers. 35 had been destroyed, none had scored a hit. On the bridge of Akagi, Nagumo's officers were beginning to allow themselves the smallest, most dangerous feeling a commander can permit himself in a battle he does not yet understand: relief. Below them, the Zero fighters of the Combat Air Patrol had pursued the torpedo bombers all the way down to wave-top altitude. They had been firing, climbing, diving, refueling on the carriers between engagements. They had been doing it for 90 minutes. They were exhausted, they were running low on ammunition, and they were no longer where they were supposed to be. The Japanese fighters were at 500 feet above the ocean. 14,000 feet above them, the sky was empty. At 10 o'clock, 3 squadrons of American dive bombers were converging on the Japanese fleet from 2 different directions, and Nagumo did not know they existed. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, 40, leading the dive bomber group from Enterprise, had spent the past hour flying his 33 Dauntless dive bombers in the wrong direction. His fuel was critical. His pilots were tired. He was almost ready to turn for home when he saw, far below, the white wake of a single Japanese destroyer steaming north at high speed. He guessed correctly that it was racing to rejoin its task force. He followed it. 20 minutes later, the Kido Butai unrolled beneath him. What happened next was an accident of communication that would change the war. McCluskey's 2 squadrons had been ordered to split between Kaga and Akagi. Due to a misunderstanding of his attack signal, both squadrons pushed over toward the same target, Kaga. At the last possible moment, Lieutenant Richard Best, the leader of Bombing 6, realized what was happening, pulled out of his dive, and took 2 wingmen with him toward Akagi. 28 Dauntlesses would attack Kaga, 3 would attack Akagi. It would be enough, at the same moment, by a coincidence so improbable that post-war historians would write about it for decades. The 17 dive bombers of Bombing 3 from Yorktown, under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, 39, arrived overhead of Soryu from another direction. Leslie had been an unlucky man that morning. A faulty electrical arming switch had jettisoned his own bomb into the sea on the way to the target. He stayed at the front of his squadron anyway, leading them through anti-aircraft fire toward a target he could no longer himself bomb. It was 20 past 10. On Akagi, the flight decks had finally been cleared. The Midway strike had been recovered. The reserve had been rearmed correctly. The targets had been confirmed. Nagumo had given the order to launch. The first Japanese aircraft began to roll. A lookout on the cruiser tone screamed. In the next 6 minutes, the war in the Pacific changed. McCluskey's Dauntlesses came down in near vertical dives from 14,000 feet at 300 miles per hour. Anti-aircraft fire opened up. It was too late and the angle was wrong. Akagi took a single bomb amidships near the central elevator. It punched through the wooden flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar where fueled and armed strike aircraft were waiting to be sent topside. The hangar erupted, fuel lines ruptured, bombs detonated, aircraft loaded with their own fuel and their own ordnance became weapons against the ship that carried them. A near miss off the port quarter buckled her rudder beyond repair. The flight deck split open. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, recovering in his cabin below, would later write that the flames did not rise. They climbed like something alive, 200 feet into the morning sky, and the secondary explosions inside the ship sounded, he wrote, like the heartbeat of a wounded animal that did not yet know it was dying. Nagumo did not move. His officers shouted around him. The fire mains had ruptured. Communications were failing. Black smoke was pouring into the bridge from below. Kusaka eventually took his arm. "Admiral, the ship is finished. We must transfer command." Nagumo would not leave. He had to be physically lowered down a knotted rope to a waiting destroyer. Kaga was already dying. The 28 Dauntlesses that had pushed over against her in the confused first moments of the dive had put 4 bombs into her in less than 2 minutes. One detonated near the island superstructure, killing the captain and every officer in the bridge. Another exploded among the fully fueled aircraft on the flight deck. Burning aviation gasoline poured down the elevator shafts and through the ship like rain. More than 800 men would die aboard Kaga that day. Soryu, smaller than the others, absorbed Leslie's 3 direct hits within 2 minutes and transformed into a single uncontrollable furnace. Her captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, 47, climbed to a position outside the bridge, took his sword in his hand, and refused all orders to evacuate. He went down with his ship. The crew that survived had to be pulled from the sea by destroyers that could not approach the burning hull because the paint on their own bulkheads had begun to blister from the heat. 3 carriers, 657 feet of mobile striking power each. In 6 minutes, all 3 were dead in the water. Aboard the destroyer Nawaki, to which he had been transferred, Nagumo would not speak. 10 miles to the north, the 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been temporarily separated from the formation by a rain squall and had not been seen by the American dive bombers. On her bridge, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, 49, watched 3 pillars of black smoke rising from the southern horizon and understood instantly what they meant. Yamaguchi was the most aggressive carrier admiral in the Imperial Navy. He had argued before the war that Japan should strike first, harder and faster than anyone believed possible. Many in the senior officer corps considered him one of the most promising flag officers of his generation. He was 49 years old, with a square face and a habit of speaking in short declarative sentences. He took one breath. He gave one order: launch everything we have. At 10:50, 18 dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters lifted off the deck of Hiryu and turned east, toward the American carriers whose existence Nagumo had been told was impossible 9 hours earlier. The leader of the strike followed the retreating tracks of American aircraft back to their source. Just after noon, he found Yorktown. 3 bombs hit her. The first detonated on the flight deck, killing or wounding 66 men. The second penetrated the funnel and shut down 5 of her 6 boilers. The third detonated below decks, started a fire near her aviation fuel stores, and forced Vice Admiral Fletcher to abandon Yorktown as his flagship and transfer his flag to the heavy cruiser Astoria. Tactical command of the entire American battle passed to Spruance. Yorktown stopped, listing, smoking. On Hiryu, Yamaguchi had launched a second strike at 1:30 in the afternoon, 10 torpedo bombers. 6 fighters. The flight leader was Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga, 31, the same officer who had sent the forward message that morning telling Nagumo that Midway needed a second strike. His own Kate bomber had been damaged in the morning raid. Its left wing fuel tank had been punctured by anti-aircraft fire and could not be properly repaired. With the fuel he had left, he could fly out to the American task force, and he could attack. He could not fly back. He climbed into the cockpit anyway. His pilots found Yorktown 2 hours later, underway again, the American damage control parties having performed a miracle of repair that left the Japanese pilots convinced they were attacking a different carrier, a fourth fresh one. 2 torpedoes ripped into her port side. She listed 17 degrees. The order to abandon ship was given. Tomonaga did not see the torpedoes hit. He had been shot down on his run. The man who had told Nagumo at 7 that morning that Midway needed a second strike, the message that had set in motion the rearming, the indecision, the doomed reshuffle of ordnance below decks, was now dead, somewhere in the water beneath the carrier he had helped to kill. For a single hour that afternoon, the carrier war in the Pacific appeared to balance. 3 Japanese carriers had been destroyed. 2 American attacks on a single American carrier seemed to have killed her in return. In the wardrooms of the combined fleet, men allowed themselves to believe that something could still be salvaged. Then Hiryu's position was found. At 5 in the afternoon, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise, some of them flown by the survivors of the morning's slaughter, pushed over into their dives. 4 bombs hit Hiryu in rapid succession. The same catastrophe that had killed her 3 sisters now killed her. Fueled aircraft on the flight deck became bombs. Fire poured through the hangar. By nightfall, the last carrier of the Kido Butai was a blazing wreck, dead in the water, her engineering spaces being abandoned, her admiral and her captain still aboard. In a single day, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, more than 240 aircraft, and over 3,000 men, including more than 100 irreplaceable veteran pilots, whose training could not be repeated inside the war that remained. 300 miles to the northwest, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto sat in the operations room and listened to a radio that was no longer telling him anything. His staff officers stood around him in silence. They were waiting for him to say something. He did not yet know what to say. The cabin was quiet for a long time. Outside, the Pacific had darkened into a sea no Japanese officer had ever sailed across before. There had been defeats, skirmishes lost, a destroyer here, a cruiser there, but nothing like this. Nothing of this scale. Nothing that ended 4 fleet carriers in a single day. Commander Yasuji Watanabe, 48, the senior operations officer of the combined fleet, was the first to speak. He had served at Yamamoto's elbow for years. He knew the Admiral's silences well enough to know that this one was different. Quietly, he proposed the only thing left. "Sir, we can still close them at night. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, surface action." Yamamoto did not answer immediately. Behind Watanabe, Captain Kamito Kuroshima, 49, Yamamoto's senior planning officer, unrolled the chart across the operations table. Kuroshima was an eccentric figure in a navy that prized eccentricity. He worked alone in his cabin for days at a time. He chain-smoked. He had been the man who, in quieter years, had quietly shaped the original Pearl Harbor plan into the operation that had begun the war. Now he looked down at the geometry of the ocean east of Midway and worked the numbers aloud. Yamato could make 27 knots. The American carriers, if they chose to run, could make 30. Every hour of pursuit widened the gap, and Spruance would run. Spruance had won. He had crippled half the Imperial Japanese Navy's striking strength in a single morning. He had no reason to risk a night brawl against superior battleships and torpedo cruisers. He would withdraw eastward at high speed, regroup, and return at first light with the same dive bombers that had killed Akagi and Kaga and Soryu and Hiryu. The arithmetic was finished before Kuroshima set down his pencil. Yamamoto knew it, Watanabe knew it, Kuroshima had known it before he started drawing, but the order was given anyway. Just after sundown, every battleship, cruiser, and destroyer in the combined fleet that could still steam was ordered to converge on the American task force at maximum speed. The invasion transports carrying 5,000 soldiers toward an island that would not be invaded were ordered to reverse course and rendezvous with the main body. Across hundreds of miles of Black Ocean, the warships of an empire began to race east in the dark. They would not reach the Americans before dawn. They could not. And shortly before midnight, the radio intelligence summary arrived in the operations room of the Yamato. Buried inside it was the conclusion the staff had been refusing to consider all evening. American radio traffic over the previous weeks indicated that the United States Navy had not merely guessed at the time and place of the Midway operation. It had known, not in outline. In detail, the composition of the strike force, the axis of approach, the date, the role of the diversion, the intent, the Japanese naval code had been broken, not yesterday, not last week, for months. The staff officers did not speak. There was, finally, nothing left to say. Aboard a heavy cruiser steaming west to rejoin the main body, Commander Minoru Genda lay propped against pillows, still feverish, finally awake enough to understand what had happened. He had been told the basic facts an hour earlier. Now he turned to the staff officer beside him and asked the question that would define the rest of his life. Did they know we were coming? The officer did not answer. He did not have to. At 2:55 on the morning of June 5, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy, signed the order cancelling the operation he had designed. For the first time since the war began, Japan was in retreat, and then the retreat tried to kill them too. A few hours later, the heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, part of a close support group that had been steaming toward Midway to bombard the airfield, received the cancellation order in the middle of the night. They turned. Sometime before dawn, Lookout spotted the periscope feather of the American submarine USS Tambor. The Japanese formation made an emergency turn to evade. Most of the ships took the turn correctly. Mogami did not. Her bow drove into Mikuma's port side at 28 knots. The crash crumpled both ships and ruptured Mikuma's fuel tanks. Heavy oil began bleeding into the sea behind her, a long dark ribbon that would lie on the water for hours. Both cruisers slowed to 12 knots. Damage control teams worked through the rest of the night patching ruptured plating, but the fuel kept leaking. By sunrise, the two crippled ships were trailing a black trail across the surface of the ocean like a wounded animal in the snow. That morning, a PBY Catalina patrol plane out of Midway spotted the slick. The dive bombers came in waves. On the afternoon of June 6th, aircraft from Enterprise and Hornet found Mikuma again and put 5 direct bomb hits into her. Fires consumed the ship from stern to bow. She capsized in the evening, taking down with her more than 700 officers and men. Mogami, hit by 6 bombs, somehow stayed afloat and limped back across the Pacific. She would spend a year in dry dock. She would never be the ship she had been before, that turn taken badly in the wrong direction. Behind the fleeing fleet, the 4 burning carriers continued their long deaths. At dawn on June 5th, with Akagi still ablaze and listing, with her crew evacuated to escorting destroyers, Yamamoto gave the order to scuttle her. Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into the hull of the flagship that had launched the strike on Pearl Harbor. She sank in deep water. Kaga had already gone down the previous evening, capsizing with more than 800 men still trapped inside. Soryu had slipped beneath the waves late on June 4th. Her captain went down with her. Waju was the last. Through the night, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi and Captain Tameokaku, 49, the ship's commanding officer, had refused all orders to evacuate. They had moved the surviving crew to the destroyer Makigumo. Then they had returned to the bridge of their burning ship and waited. In the early hours, Yamaguchi removed his hat, the white-peaked cap of a flag officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and handed it to a young staff officer who would survive and carry it home. He asked the man to give it to his family. Then he and Kaku stood on the bridge of Hiryu in the dark, looking at the moon. Survivors who saw the ship before they were ordered below would remember, for the rest of their lives, two small black figures silhouetted against orange flame, motionless, side by side, as the destroyer Makigumo turned and fired the torpedoes that broke the keel of the last carrier of the Kido Butai. She sank just after sunrise on June 5th. Yamaguchi was 49. Kaku was the same age. They were the last admiral and the last captain of the most powerful naval striking force the world had ever seen. 5 days later, on June 10, 1942, Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo issued a communique announcing a great victory at Midway. 2 American carriers, the announcement said, had been sunk. 150 American aircraft destroyed. Japan, the communique acknowledged, had lost 1 aircraft carrier of its own and seen a second damaged. It did not name them. 3 of the 4 carriers that had been on the bottom of the Pacific for 5 days, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, would not appear in any official Japanese announcement for the rest of the war. Neither would Mikuma, neither would Tomonaga or Yanagimoto or Yamaguchi. The newspapers ran the official text without correction. The families of the dead were not informed. Surviving sailors were placed in isolated barracks, forbidden to write home, forbidden to mention the names of their ships, forbidden to speak of what they had seen. Some were rotated through quiet shore commands. Others were posted to remote garrisons until they could be sent forward into other battles where their silence would, eventually, be made permanent. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers. 1 heavy cruiser sunk, another permanently maimed, more than 240 aircraft, 3,057 men, among them more than 100 veteran pilots whose training could not be repeated in the war that remained. The United States lost the carrier Yorktown, torpedoed 2 days after the battle by a Japanese submarine while under tow back to Pearl Harbor, 145 aircraft, 307 men. On paper, a lopsided exchange. In reality, the asymmetry ran far deeper than any tally. American shipyards were already laying the keels of the Essex-class fleet carriers that would by 1944 give the United States Navy more carriers in commission than every other navy on Earth combined. Japan's largest yards could build 1 fleet carrier every 18 months under optimum conditions. Those conditions no longer existed. The materials were running out. The pilots could not be replaced fast enough. The war, in the long math, had ended on June 4, 1942. It would simply take the next 3 years for everyone alive on that day to be told. 10 months later, on April 18, 1943, 1 year to the day after the Doolittle raid had embarrassed the Imperial Navy by bombing Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto flew on an inspection tour of forward air bases in the Solomon Islands. The same American code-breaking apparatus that had read the plan for Midway read the itinerary for the flight. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal lifted off at dawn, flew 435 miles at wave-top altitude over open ocean, intercepted Yamamoto's bomber over the jungle of southern Bougainville, and shot it down. His body was found at the crash site the next day. His gloved hand was still resting on the hilt of his sword. Japan announced his death in May and declared a day of national mourning. They did not announce that the Americans had read the message. The code-breaking machinery that had set the trap at Midway had simply continued running. The men in the basement at Pearl Harbor had never stopped reading the mail. They had read it on June 4th. They had read it on April 18th. They were reading it the day Yamamoto's funeral procession moved through Tokyo, and they were reading it the day after and the day after that. The trap that the Japanese admirals had realized they sailed into at Midway was not a battle plan. It was an entire war. 2 years later, on the night of July 6, 1944, in the same command cave where this story began, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo took his own life. According to his aide, his last recorded words referred not to Saipan, not to the war, not to the empire he had served for 40 years. They referred to a morning on the bridge of a ship that had been resting at the bottom of the Pacific for 2 years. I should have died there. The trap at Midway was not set by American dive bombers. It was set by Japanese certainty that such a trap could not exist. By the assumption that the enemy was crippled, distracted, predictable, by the confidence that a code so complex could not be read, by the belief that intelligence dismissed often enough would eventually stop being true. by the conviction, shared from the most junior officer on the bridge of Akagi to the man at the operations table of Yamato 300 miles away, that they were the hunters. They had been the prey from the moment they sailed, and by the time they understood that, in the long hours of June 4th and the longer night that followed, it was already too late to do anything but die well, lie about it, and continue forward toward an ending none of them would see, and most of them already knew was coming.